You've heard the stories, the miracles, the teachings, the parables about kingdoms and mustard seeds. But here's what almost nobody talks about. The people listening to those words were drowning in debt. Not metaphorical debt, real debt. The kind that cost you your land, your livelihood, your future. Welcome to Golden Without Witness, where we follow the money to find the truth. Because the world of first-century Judea wasn't a religious stage set. It was an economic battlefield, and most people were losing. When Jesus was born, the Roman Empire had perfected something remarkable, a system that could extract wealth from millions of people, move it thousands of miles, and make it all seem normal, even necessary. Rome didn't just take by force. It built institutions that made extraction look like order. Taxes looked like civilization. Poverty looked like personal failure. Judea was caught in this machine. Not because it was particularly wealthy, it wasn't. The region was mostly agricultural, mostly marginal, mostly one bad season away from catastrophe. That's precisely why it mattered to Rome. Every province, no matter how poor, had to pay. That was the point. Rome's power didn't come from conquering rich territories. It came from making poor territories pay anyway. The system ran on a simple principle. Money flows up, never down. Grain from Egypt fed Rome. Silver from Spain filled Roman treasuries. Labor from Gaul built Roman roads. And taxes from Judea kept the whole mechanism running. Nobody asked if Judea could afford it. The question was irrelevant. If you want to understand how money really shaped history, hit that subscribe button now. Because what comes next gets even more uncomfortable. Here's how money really worked in Jesus' time. It didn't flow, it compressed. Every year, the same people owed more than the year before. Not because they spent recklessly or lived beyond their means, because the math was designed that way. Start with taxes. Imperial taxes came first, land taxes based on acreage, not harvest. Tribute taxes for the privilege of Roman occupation. Poll taxes just for existing. These weren't negotiable. They weren't adjusted for bad years. A drought didn't reduce your obligation. A plague didn't buy you time. You owed what you owed, and you owed it now. But it didn't stop there. Religious obligations piled on top. Every Jewish male paid an annual temple tax, offerings for festivals, tithes on produce, fees to change currency because Roman coins weren't acceptable in the temple. None of this was optional. It was community expectation backed by divine command. Now add this up. For a small farmer working maybe 5 acres, annual obligations could easily hit 30 to 40% of total production. In a good year, that was survivable. Barely. But ancient agriculture didn't have good years consistently. It had droughts, locusts, early frosts, late rains. Any deviation from ideal conditions meant shortfall. And shortfall meant one thing: debt. This is where the trap closed. You couldn't just skip payment and try again next year. The system didn't pause. Tax collectors, usually local contractors who paid Rome up front and then collected with interest, didn't accept excuses. If you couldn't pay, you borrowed. And once you borrowed, the interest clock started ticking. Ancient interest rates were brutal by modern standards. 25% annually was common. 50% wasn't unusual. There was no regulation, no consumer protection, no maximum rate. The lender set the terms. Take it or face immediate consequences. Most people took it. Here's what happened next. You borrow to pay this year's taxes. Next year comes. You still owe the original debt plus interest, but you also owe next year's taxes. Maybe the harvest is better, maybe it's not. Either way, you're now paying obligations on 2 years from 1 year's production. The math doesn't work. It was never supposed to work. Within a few cycles, the debt becomes larger than any realistic harvest could repay. At that point, the only asset left is land, and land was exactly what creditors wanted. Not money, land, because land generated rents forever. One family's crisis became another family's investment. This wasn't random misfortune. It was wealth transfer by design. Every defaulted debt moved property from the poor to the connected. Over decades, the pattern was unmistakable. Small farms disappeared. Large estates expanded. Wealthy families, often with ties to Roman administration or temple hierarchy, accumulated vast holdings. The displaced didn't vanish. They became tenants on land they once owned, sharecroppers giving half or more of their harvest to landlords, day laborers competing for work that paid barely enough to eat. Or they disappeared entirely into cities, swelling populations of the desperate poor who survived on intermittent labor and occasional charity. This created a specific kind of economy, not a free market where hard work translated into security. Not even a traditional peasant economy where most people stayed poor but stayed stable. This was something else, a system optimized for concentration. Wealth didn't circulate. It accumulated, and once accumulated, it rarely came back. The Roman Empire didn't invent inequality, but it industrialized it. It built legal frameworks that protected creditors absolutely and debtors barely. It enforced property rights for the wealthy while offering no protection for the vulnerable. It treated debt as sacred obligation and poverty as personal failure. Local elites collaborated because they benefited. They collected taxes for Rome and kept a cut. They loaned money at high interest. They bought distressed land at discounts. They employed desperate labor at minimal cost. The system enriched them at every level, and they had no incentive to change it. Temple authorities collaborated too, though they justified it differently. They spoke of holiness, purity, and divine order. But the temple functioned as an economic institution. It held reserves of silver. It controlled valuable land. It employed hundreds of people, and its operations depended on a population that, no matter how poor, still paid their religious obligations. This is the crucial point. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. Poverty wasn't a bug. It was a feature, because desperate people accept terms that secure people reject. Desperate people don't rebel. They survive, and survival doesn't threaten power. By the time of Jesus, this pressure had been building for generations. Judea wasn't on the edge of collapse. It was past the edge, held together only by force and the exhaustion of alternatives. Banditry was epidemic. But these weren't just criminals. They were displaced farmers, landless peasants, people with nothing left to lose. They raided because raiding was the only redistribution available. Rome called them criminals. The population often called them heroes. Messianic movements appeared constantly, preachers promising relief, justice, divine intervention. Some claimed to be prophets. Others claimed to be kings. A few claimed to be both. Rome killed them systematically. But new ones kept appearing because the conditions that produced them never changed. Tax revolts flared periodically. Entire villages would refuse payment. These didn't last. Rome responded with overwhelming violence. Crucifixions weren't hidden. They were public. They were designed to terrify. The message was simple: pay or die. Most people paid. But paying didn't mean accepting. Resentment was universal. People knew the system was rigged. They knew hard work didn't guarantee security. They knew their obligations funded Roman luxury and local elite comfort while they barely survived. They weren't stupid. They weren't blind. They were trapped. And trapped people develop a specific kind of consciousness. They don't believe in fairness. They don't trust institutions. They don't expect justice, but they crave it. desperately, which means they listen to anyone who speaks that language convincingly. This is the world Jesus entered, not as a theologian addressing abstract spiritual questions, as a voice speaking directly into economic desperation. And when he spoke about debt, forgiveness, release, and reversal, his audience didn't hear metaphors. They heard survival. Jesus didn't propose an economic policy. He didn't outline tax reform or debt restructuring. He didn't promise to redistribute land or overthrow Roman administration. What he did was more dangerous. He attacked legitimacy. Every oppressive system needs a moral story. It needs people to believe suffering is necessary, deserved, or temporary. It needs the poor to blame themselves. It needs the wealthy to feel justified. It needs everyone to accept that this is just how things are. Jesus dismantled that story. When he said the poor were blessed, he wasn't offering consolation. He was reversing the moral hierarchy. The system said poverty reflected failure. Jesus said poverty reflected injustice. The system said wealth proved virtue. Jesus said wealth proved exploitation. When he spoke about debt forgiveness, he wasn't being poetic. Debt forgiveness was real. It meant cancellation. It meant reset. It meant escape. And by centering it in his teaching, he suggested that debt itself, not the debtor, was the problem. When he ate with tax collectors and sinners, he wasn't just being inclusive. He was demonstrating that the categories the system used to justify exclusion were artificial. Purity wasn't about following rules enforced by institutions that profited from those rules. It was about something else entirely. And when he spoke about the kingdom of God, he wasn't describing heaven. He was describing an alternative order, one where the current arrangement wasn't final, where the first could be last, where the powerful could fall, where everything could be different. This was subversive in a specific way. It didn't threaten Rome's legions. It threatened Rome's moral authority, and that mattered more than people realize. Empires can survive hatred. They struggle when people stop believing their power is legitimate. Then came the temple incident. Jesus entered the court of the Gentiles, where money changers and animal vendors operated, and overturned their tables. He drove them out. He called the temple a den of robbers. Modern readers often interpret this as religious anger. Jesus was upset about commercialism in a sacred space, but that misses the economic reality. The temple wasn't just a place of worship. It was a financial institution. It collected taxes. It held reserves. It controlled currency exchange. And it did all of this while claiming divine mandate. The money changers weren't there by accident. They were there because the system required them. You couldn't pay the temple tax in Roman currency. You needed Tyrian shekels, which meant you needed to exchange money, which meant you paid a fee, which meant the poor paid more, proportionally, than the rich. And all of this was justified as religious obligation. When Jesus disrupted this, he wasn't attacking prayer. He was attacking the machinery that monetized access to God. He was exposing how religious authority had become indistinguishable from economic extraction. He was making visible what everyone knew but couldn't name. The institution meant to represent justice was reproducing injustice. This crossed a line. Temple authorities depended on Roman approval. Rome depended on stable revenue. Both needed the population to accept the system as legitimate. Jesus, by challenging that legitimacy publicly during Passover, when Jerusalem was packed with pilgrims, became intolerable. The charge that ultimately stuck was political, claiming to be king, but the real threat was economic. He wasn't disrupting trade routes or tax collection. He was disrupting the story that made those things acceptable, and stories once questioned are hard to repair. Rome won, obviously. Within a generation, Judea erupted in revolt, and Rome destroyed it. The temple fell, Jerusalem burned, hundreds of thousands died. The economic and political infrastructure of Jewish life was dismantled. Roman control was absolute. But winning territory isn't the same as winning the argument. Jesus hadn't led an army. He hadn't seized power. He hadn't even tried. So killing him and crushing the revolt didn't eliminate what he'd introduced: doubt about whether the system was natural, necessary, or moral. In the decades after, small communities formed that operated differently. They shared resources. They practiced mutual aid. They canceled debts within their groups. They structured loyalty around belief rather than land or status. These weren't revolutions. They were alternatives. And alternatives are dangerous to empires in ways rebellions aren't. Because rebellions can be crushed. Alternatives multiply. They adapt. They survive underground. They move with people rather than depending on institutions. And over centuries, they erode the moral foundation that makes domination feel inevitable. By the 4th century, Rome didn't eliminate this alternative framework. It absorbed it. Christianity became the imperial religion, which seems like a victory for Rome. But look closer. Authority now required moral justification. Power had to claim virtue. Extraction had to be defended, not just enforced. The economy Jesus critiqued didn't disappear. Debt continued. Inequality continued. Extraction continued. But it could no longer claim to be divinely ordained without challenge. That's not nothing. Here's the uncomfortable lesson. Economic systems don't fail because they're unjust. They fail when people stop believing the stories that justify them. Rome perfected extraction, but it never repaired the legitimacy crisis that began when someone stood in the temple and said out loud that the machinery of holiness had become the machinery of robbery. Systems wrapped in moral language are extraordinarily resilient. They survive suffering. They survive resistance. They even survive temporary defeats. What they can't survive is widespread disbelief. The moment when enough people stop accepting that poverty is deserved, debt is natural, and suffering is the price of order. Money worked in Jesus' time the same way it works now, by moving up and staying there. The difference is what people believed about whether that was inevitable. And belief, it turns out, is the most valuable commodity of all. If this changed how you see history, subscribe, because the past has more answers than you think. You just have to know where to look.